Good morning and welcome to Armstrong Wolf's 3 days focusing on conduct and culture. Wrapped up in the title Conduct and Culture Summit 220, Purpose over Profit. It is somewhat appropriate that we're gathering on these 3 days in the shadow of and the echoes of the funeral this weekend of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, an individual who committed himself to a lifetime service to his Queen, his wife, and his country. A man who personified himself by his charitable giving, by his leadership, and his purpose. Those are all themes that we're investigating over the next 3 days. And indeed, I believe this to be the first world's gathering of COOs, both banking markets and asset management, focused on one subject. I'm Maurice Evelyn Bufton. I'm the CEO of Armstrong Wolf. So what is it that we do? 12 months ago, this would have been a very, very different story, a very different summary. But over the last 12 months, we've changed, much of it due to the support and advocacy of the COO community itself. So let's talk about who we are today. We are a COO advisory firm whose mission is to create a worldwide network of COOs, one point of separation away from each other. And today, as we stand, we have around about 5,000 chief operating officers, CAOs, chief of staff, chief control officers in a worldwide community. Our purpose is to provide a platform for information exchange, the sharing of ideas and development of solutions to address market-wide non-proprietary challenges, of which conduct and culture are two very good examples. We deliver this through the International COO Community, ICOOC, Women in the COO Community, WCOOC, the Armstrong Wolf Institute, the COO Academy, and Armstrong Wolf Partners. Our corporate and social responsibilities are embodied by our commitments to addressing the issues around inequalities through Women in the COO Community and the COO Academy, and also through our charitable foundation, supporting children and young adults in central Bosnia. We also use our platform to promote the cause and the debate around the imperative nature of climate change. Finally, though, and what many would not see as a corporate and social responsibility, we use our platform, and part of our mission is to raise the debate around conduct and behavior, integrity, leadership. Mostly, this is to ensure that we can help the industry repair its reputation and avoid the mistakes of the past. So it may be enough to stop here and welcome you. It may be enough to say that we're going to focus on conduct and its siblings, culture and purpose, that we have 20 webinars, 40 global and regional COOs attending. We have AFME and the FCA talking, and we have some of the world's leading academics and some of the finest professional services companies with a deep-rooted interest and a deep-rooted capability in the subjects under debate. More so that we have over 1,000 people registered this week, a fantastic representation of the industry from all regions, from the cities that we served in Canada, North America, across Europe, Middle East, and into Asia. So let's talk about the storyline of the 3 days. It comes at a point when I believe, and many believe, that the industry has reached a steady state in relation to its design, development, and implementation of governance and first and second line processes and policies to meet the demands as outset by the regulators, all herded together in the mystical 3 lines of defense. We're now pivoting in relation to, from what we must do to what we can do, or what we could do, or what we married to what we should do. We're looking at how we partner in relation to technology and behavioral science. We're looking at the evolving and potential changing around the governance model. We're looking around how behavioral analytics and behavioral science could support leadership, and what other tools are available to leadership to help drive the industry forward in a safer environment. So these are the things that we're actually going to be talking about. The 3 days are broken down into 3 particular areas. One is around leadership and purpose, more of the qualitative side of things. And then it's actually how do you take the qualitative side and quantify it? So evolving technologies and looking at behavioral analytics and looking at behavioral science. And then thirdly, to the role of the COO and the Chief Control Officer that have evolved and continue to evolve. And in many ways, the industry is committed to enable them to evolve to meet the emerging and continued challenges around the challenge of conduct and culture. These are the 3 days. This captures it. But what I'm not going to do is stop there. I just want to give a personal view of how we came to this point. What was the origin of these 3 days? And I hope the next few minutes is not going to be seen as some form of self-indulgence, because it's not supposed to be, but it is relevant to the conversation today. I'm not going to talk about my childhood, where I was brought up in the Christian faith and guided by parents who demonstrated leadership and integrity and honesty in all they did. But I'm going to talk about the first time I sort of had my personal sense of responsibility to society and others. And this was in 1990, when I was privileged to pass off the square from the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. This is equivalent to West Point for those joining from the US. I was the 3rd generation to go into the British Army, my father and grandfather also serving. And as I passed off the square of Sandhurst, I turned to my father and asked him, "Dad, how do you make a good officer? How do you make a good leader?" He looked at me inquisitively and said, "Well, that's quite easy, son. You've just got to remember one thing. They salute the rank and they fight for the man." A simple adage and something I've tried to carry through my whole life. I've fallen short of it on many occasions, but tried to drag myself back up to that high point as many times as I can do. And my military service took me to some wonderful places and gave me some wonderful experiences, culminating in serving with the United Nations in Bosnia in 1994. This was an extraordinary moment, a privilege for myself to serve my soldiers. And that point of serving your soldiers is something I'm going to investigate and touch on later. In April 1994, I was in Gorazde in Bosnia, having served 7 months in an exclusion zone on behalf of the United Nations, surrounded by some of the most wonderful, inspirational individuals at all ranks. 6 weeks later, I was celebrating my first placement working for a company called Robert Walters Recruitment in the city. That placement was a FX confirmation clerk on £3.75 an hour into Citibank in Lewisham, South London. And I can remember the client now, Paul Hutchins, still in the industry, has done exceptionally well and now at Deutsche Bank. I then went on to set up my own business. And what happened in 2008 is very important because that is the trigger point that led us to today, or certainly led myself to today. In Q4 2007, I'd invested with my partners in new offices, new hires, and the expectations of good times to come following the heady days leading up to 2008. We're all aware of actually what happened in Q1 2008, the credit crunch. As a business, we were tied intricately to 2 banks, Lehman Brothers and RBS. You can imagine, therefore, that the period was at least painful. In fact, it was catastrophic for the business. At the same time, my father had actually gone into hospital to have a keyhole surgery on his knee. They gave him the wrong drug through medical negligence, instigated a stroke. Secondary negligence is that they failed to identify this. Ultimately, he died a terrible death over a period of 6 months. He was a retail banker, an area managing director for Barclays Bank. He'd spent almost 40 years of his life dedicated to the industry and to Barclays, and in good faith, left all his life's value, its stock, and his reward in Barclays stock. Barclays, like all others, had a catastrophic drop in value. I didn't have the heart to tell my father, as he lay on his deathbed, that his statement that at least I know I've left your mother in good order financially was no longer a resounding yes, for he'd lost circa 80% of his life's work. Professionally hit and personally hit, Trafalgar Partnership having to close, and my father passing away, I set myself on a journey of trying to understand how this all happened. I set myself on a journey to look into conduct, misconduct, and the origins of the credit crunch. This led me to set up in 2012 Armstrong Wolff. It enabled me to marry my inquisitive nature and trying to understand the bedrock and the reasons behind conduct and the evolving role of the COO. Much of my time recruitment has been undertaken working in product control and middle office, and many of those have migrated into the role of business management, CA or COO. So by coincidence, not by design, I was able to bring in my interest within conduct and its origin and the COO. And the conduct agenda was falling right into the in tray of the COO. So I set up Armstrong Wolff. And what in a name? First of all, I thought Evelyn Bufton Associates sounded slightly ridiculous. Secondly, I wanted something that meant something to me and had a purpose. So just bear with me a little while. In 1812, yes, 1812, 37 officers of my regiment, the Gloucester Regiment, went into battle at Salamanca in Spain with Napoleon's forces. 35 of those 37 officers were killed and slain on the day, and only 2 young officers were left standing, holding the regimental standard at the end of the day, which was not surrendered, was not given up, and they were noted in dispatches to the Duke of Wellington, noted for their bravery and their fortitude. Those 2 young men were Lieutenants Armstrong and Lieutenants Wolff. So the name Armstrong Wolff is in recognition and memory of 2 young men that had an individual purpose and had courage and demonstrated courage and leadership over 200 years ago. Let's move forward then to my first Chief Control Officer search. Around about 2014, 2015, ironically and appropriately again, Barclays actually engaged me to do a search around sourcing for a Chief Control Officer. It was the first time that a CCO search of this nature had been undertaken. And not was it just a point of education for myself. When I was going to the market, I was saying I'm doing a search for CCO. The common refrain was, what's that, Chief Compliance Officer or some Chief Country Officer? I said, no, it's Chief Control Officer. They said, well, what do you want? Do you want a operations manager? I said, no, actually, ideally what we'd like is a front office fixed income business manager, someone who's lived real-time operational risk. This was the soiree into the world of first line defense and the emerging role of the Chief Control Officer. In fact, I penned my first article then, defining the indefinable, the evolution of the Chief Control Officer. Invited 20 COOs for dinner at the RAC in London on Pall Mall, and actually 28 turned up. Nothing to say with probably content or even my own character, more about the fine fare and the location. And at the end of the debate, where many of the CEOs around the table going, well, actually, if you're seeing the CCO position actually exists, then actually it's within my mandate already. I am the Chief Control Officer. And at the end of the dinner, David Long, the then EMEA COO for Credit Suisse, piped up that I actually rather enjoyed this. Can we actually have another? Can we actually host the next one? And actually, the next one we hosted 4 weeks later with Credit Suisse, and that was on the subject of conduct. And so started the journey that took us to today. So started the journey that saw the evolution of the COO during this period, and for me to actually understand, mirror, and partner that community. And when we look at the role of the COO since 2008, I think you can largely see how the COO role has mirrored the demands of the day. It's been shaped by the book of work that actually has been on the markets, and actually over the last 6 or 7 years been particularly focused around the agenda of the regulators and meeting the regulatory agenda, and then also particularly focused on cost and efficiencies. Pre-2020 and pre-COVID, there were, however, emerging themes that this role and this focus was starting to change. Yes, conduct had been truly embedded in the COO's office, first line controls and conduct, and the evolution of the chief control officer from one sitting lonely at that round table dinner in 2015 to almost every single bank having by title or other a first line controls, first line risk and conduct officer. The themes were, as we were moving in from a steady state and starting to pivot forward, how the COO could potentially be engaged more in strategy and innovation and potentially threat management, looking at non-financial risk and taking an anticipatory foot, move from hindsight to foresight. Those themes were starting to take hold across the market. And of course, within that, you have a change in the competency requirements of the COO. Over the last 8 or 9 years, when we've been looking at the regulatory agenda, not surprisingly, a lot of individuals have come from, say, an operations background, a finance background, an analytical background, to actually deal with the data and deal with the detail of the agenda in which they were set. But as we said, the COO and the chat is, they meet the relative importance of the business agenda at the time. So what do we see actually as the potential profile and the competencies required and the demands required of the COO and the Chief Control Officer at this moment moving forward? I think overall what we're seeing is a pivot from both the COO and the Control Officer to take a more commercial view of the world, to look forward. And to do this, arguably, you need a better handle around risk management and technology and innovation. Certainly 5 years ago or 6 years ago when we started these forums, data and cloud would have not been resident points of debate or agenda items being requested by the COO community, but they are today. And then we have the pandemic. All change. But what has the pandemic done for the internal and the external perceptions of the mandate of the COO? It's certainly given it greater visibility. I think it's given the platform to demonstrate its capability, and certainly it has demonstrated its influence and oversight. And that's where we are today. It has most certainly raised the profile and led the question of, so what? In one of the later debates or webinars, I think on day 3, we look at, was it just a moment of time? Has it just been a moment of time when then the crisis called and the COO answered, and then once we end, it will return to normality? Or is there the possibility, as we go into a new paradigm, that the role of the COO will evolve and change to take advantage of the way that it's demonstrated its value over the last 12 months? So in the last 12 months, it's almost as if the COO has been redesigned as the crisis manager, of which continuity is just a part. And I give an example in Asia that I heard. A new CEO moving from Europe to Asia in the 4th week of January last year. Suddenly within 4 weeks being faced with the challenge of the pandemic. The CEO tells me that there's only one single thing that enabled her to be successful during that period, and that was the COO in place, the continuity person, the de facto number 2 in the business, who had been the COO for some time. And it's an interesting point to actually raise, because I've seen many times over the years when a new CEO or head of the business has moved into position, and some of the collateral immediate damage is actually the resident CEO has been removed, and someone that they know and trust and worked with in the past is actually brought forward into that position. And I think just the single example that we give around the CEO last year of moving into a new location onto a platform of continuity, consistency and reliability by the COO in place demonstrates that there is a danger in aligning too much to the value of someone you've worked with and that you can trust and bring into a position, and undervaluing the institutional knowledge and the role of the COO that you inherit, and that can enable you to be more effective and get up and running far quicker. So that's a point of note. We then look at, so what potential areas does the COO look as if it could change over the next 4 to 5 months and take forward. And in no particular order. When I speak to COOs, many say that their role in, say, for example, communications has changed. Pre-pandemic, many of the communications that they're making would have previously been made maybe by HR. They are now making many firm-wide, company-wide presentations and communications on behalf of the COO. Then there's human capital management. As we move into the new paradigm and the bookends between everyone back into the office for permanent place of work to full optionality, whatever happens, most organizations are going to have some form of hybrid model. And to make that effective, to ensure productivity, to ensure lack of fatigue, to ensure a culture of allegiance, training is going to be required, and the COOs are finding themselves far more embedded in understanding the implications and design of training. Yes, working with HR, but far more a book of their work now and potentially for the foreseeable future. Conduct had already been a well-embedded part of the COO's role within the mandate of the Chief Control Officer. In part now sponsored by the drive, for example, by the FCA around culture and purpose, wrapped around and partnering, as I said right at the beginning, the siblings of conduct are purpose and culture. And they are falling within to the mandate of the COO. Not accountable for them because they're bosses, but certainly a greater level of responsibility of ensuring that the CEO's vision of culture, the CEO's vision of their corporate purpose, and the responsibilities around conduct are actually executed more readily. And then we have threat management. Threat management is, again, a webinar that we're going to be talking about on day 2. And what is it? Exponential risk, you could argue, sits on and above outside the definition of non-financial risk today. The pandemic, for example, could be seen as a comprehensive failure of the imagination by not just corporates and commerce and industry, but by centralized government. But what about geopolitical risk or monetary risk, for example? Many would argue that actually those are better served by the interests and the view of the COO rather than the Chief Risk Officer. And why? Not just because the COO is central and actually can have visibility, but also the makeup of the Chief Risk Officer. Innately, they are thinking about preventative measures in context of risk management. Whilst the COO needs to look at how, regardless of disruption and dislocation and the spectrum of risk, how can I continue to manage the business through these stormy waters, seek out opportunities to maximize profitability, while still working with and recognizing the parameters of risk that we are managing the business within. And also, it's the ability to translate those risks into operational issues. That is the role of the COO. So threat management or strategic risk or whatever we call it seems to be an emerging capability and responsibility in the role of the COO. And then to 220, February 220. As a business, we have 54 forums booked in Toronto, New York, London, Singapore, and Hong Kong. We're serving 3 groups of COOs. The market COO community, the CIB-wide controls and conduct community, the first line community, and asset management. We had hosts for each forum on site at a bank or asset manager. And then COVID happened. The umbilical cord to every single one of those forums planned was obviously cut. And we as a business ourselves were facing an exponential crisis. So in March, we went virtual. We saw our mission at that point was actually to support the COO community. In fact, the whole reason the COO network had developed and the whole reason that the COO roundtables worked under the premise that we would bring the COOs together to talk around market-wide non-proprietary challenges. COVID was that, a market-wide non-proprietary challenge. In March last year, we ran just under 40 forums for the global COO community. We gave them the platform to discuss from most granular on day one about who is using their cards, credit cards to give numbers so staff can buy laptops, all the way through to meeting the supervisory demands. And we have partnered this community throughout the whole year and seen the evolution of their challenges. And in part, we've seen the potential revolution in the relation to workforce planning, workforce models, and also potentially in relation to the further evolution of the COO role that we've just talked about. So in the last 12 months, supported by the global COO community, we have changed as a business. First of all, in April, 2 to 3 banks came to us and offered to pay us for our services in March. And a huge thanks to those that did. But we said to them, no, but you can actually support us in restructuring the business. And we set up the international COO community. We now have 40 banks as members of this community, either regional or global, and we then rolled it into asset management. We have 25. Women in the COO community was already in place, but actually has burgeoned and grown in influence and the power of its voice over the last 12 months. The COO Academy has been established, working very closely with RBC, who have a wonderful scheme, the RBC Academy in Toronto, which essentially is creating career opportunities for the underrepresented and the underprivileged, which we are rolling into New York and into London with the support of a number of the asset managers and banks. We have set up the Armstrong Institute, bringing into the business Patrick Butler, who is going to be moderating a number of the forums over the next 3 days. Patrick, best known for the work that he's done around conduct and culture, working for and still working within UK finance. Patrick's personal mission is the professionalization of the COO function and the establishment of the international COO profession, or ICOOC. We have Armstrong Wolf Partners, which is an advisory business focused on the COO, ran and led by a COO, Simon Longdon, formerly of Standard Chartered Bank. And then we have the COO magazine, quarterly, distributed now to over 5,000. It has 2 accolades. I can categorically state it is the world's best and best known COO magazine. I can also say the other accolade it has is it's also the worst because it's the only one. But it is a good read, and it is designed specifically for the audience of the 3 days, the COO community. And so what have I learned in the last 8 years, 9 years, and in the last 12 months? The one thing I can tell you, for the COO community that I work with, overridingly are decent individuals who are wholly committed to doing the right thing and serving the industry and therefore the clients and broader society that the bank holds a responsibility. And a bit of a cliche, without the help of many and the advocacy of many, then myself and Armstrong Wolf would not be where we are today, not just in the last 12 months, but even before that. And as we seek to answer the role of what purpose is, I want to reflect on a COO forum that I ran 3 years ago in New York. 21 COOs around the table, and I asked them, so what is your purpose? What's the purpose of the industry? What is your corporate purpose? The common refrain at the beginning was talking around, well, shareholder return, profitability. I said, well, take me a bit lower than that, I said. Yeah, someone piped up liquidity, creating liquidity in the market. I said, but what if I brought my 83-year-old mother, God bless her, she passed away last year. I said, what if I brought my 83-year-old mother into the room and she asked you, ladies and gentlemen, can you tell me your purpose? And you say, creating liquidity in the markets. Now, my mother was a bright individual, but I doubt she'd really understand what creating liquidity means in the market. I said, how do you visualize that? How do you visualize your output? And I think this is one of the challenges that purpose actually has in relation to embedding itself in the psyche of the industry as a whole, of corporates and then individuals. So I gave the example. I said, to me, what liquidity creates is that you can visualize an individual, a man or a woman, laying the first brick, a foundation stone on a new factory to produce cars in Detroit. By doing so, that individual will be able to take home, put food on the table, and pay for a tennis racket for their children, piano lessons for their children, will go for a restaurant. It will create the ecosystem around that area. And as the factory grows, you can see hundreds and thousands of families doing the same. And that ecosystem of bakers, of dressmakers, of shoemakers, of taxis, of coffee houses, of restaurants, of theatres, all that feeds off the liquidity that you created in the market. That foundation stone could be laid. And all the lorries that are lining up to deliver their component parts so that those cars can be developed, at their origins, all those communities are doing exactly the same. And all this happens because of the role of the industry in facilitating capital investment and funding. That's what I think purpose is about. That is the purpose. And that's why I think visualization is something that actually is more important in embedding purpose, rather than, yes, we are here to serve our clients. Yes, that is a worthy purpose. But if you serve your clients correctly, they in turn will be able to manifest itself in examples as I just talked about. So in serving your clients, the mantra that we see as purpose and the output of good culture and good conduct, in serving your clients, then that may just be the water on the seed that develops this opportunity and helps us achieve this loftier aspiration. Anyway, enough evangelism. For Armstrong Wolf, it is not the end of endeavors, but hopefully I think these 3 days is an opportunity to move from first to second base. And indeed, in May, we are running a follow-on debate. And the debate has a title, very simple. Culture is more effective than controls in preventing poor conduct. It's linear. You can only vote for one. The summit will investigate both of these over the next 3 days, and we hope you can join us in this debate later in May. Obviously, you need both. Some would argue, well, if I had to bifurcate, give me short-term controls, and then I can invest for mid-term culture, and then I get the best of both worlds. But overwhelmingly, I see this as a responsibility around leadership. I would therefore vote for culture, because culture is a byproduct of leadership. Leadership shapes culture and should therefore be a principal investment, because leadership is not the divine right of the few that it is given at birth, like many used to think, because leaders can be developed. My time at Sandhurst proves that West Point proves that. Leaders can be developed, and leadership has the domain at every single level. From the most junior individual self-leadership through to the CEO. And behind that, part of leadership is training in decision-making, which I think those two parts are probably far more important as we are in the present domain, and actually certainly as we go into a hybrid model. At Sandhurst, they taught you the overriding influence on a soldier's behavior is how they are led, and specifically the person that led them. And Sandhurst's motto, serve to lead, captures that very simple adage. And actually, I refer to Adam O'Donnell, a former SAS soldier who moved into commerce and industry, has now done exceptionally well in technology. Adam states, the biggest difference he has observed consistently between the corporate world and the military is how we view leadership. This is the link to the first webinar to follow. And I'm not saying the military has all the answers. It's made many mistakes in the past. I myself have made many leadership and perhaps more managerial mistakes in my time in setting up businesses and running businesses, as I'm sure that many of the previous employees that have worked with me would actually get remark. But I try hard to hold fast to the principles embedded me in the army and the echoes of what my father said on that day that I passed off from Sandhurst. Because from the moment that an officer cadet arrives at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, in one form or another, this institution, which has trained the British Army for over 200 years, it's drummed into you that your role is simple. It's to serve those that you lead and not the other way around. They're reminded time and time again that when they graduate, they will be given the privilege of directing, coordinating, inspiring some of the best trained and most professional troops in the world. And they're inspiring them to achieve something that individually they would never hope they could achieve working in isolation. They're left in no doubt as to what the soldiers would expect from them every single day, selfless sacrifice. This concept of putting the needs of those that we lead before us, before our own desires, our own needs, is such a central concept in military leadership that it's enshrined in a number of traditions, like in the British cavalry or the tanks as they are now. You feed the horses first, then the soldiers, then the officers. And actually, this reserved role of honor, the most senior officer is the last person to eat. And even on Christmas Day now, even to today, to capture this ethos, the soldiers are served Christmas dinner by the officers of their battalion or regiment or division. This message is hammered home all the time. Small wonder then that the Royal Military Academy's motto is serve to lead. Yes, it's a paradox that holds the key to unlocking the incredible feats of loyalty and devotion and effort in the face of overwhelming odds that applies just readily to corporate life as it does to military life. The concept of serve to lead is actually disarmingly simple, but it's not easy. Maybe that's why it's so rare in corporate life. Maybe that's one reason. But it's something that you as a boss, as a manager, should aspire to. Just a little bit of sacrifice, you could hear the echoes. Show us that we can trust you. Don't tell us. That's what staff are telling. And this starts to shape culture, a culture of allegiance, which leads to productivity coming from pride. When your grand plan calls for people to use their initiative and think for themselves, they're not listening, they're watching you. They're watching what you will do for one of them. And if one of your team makes an unintentional mistake, an innocent mistake, what are you going to do? Are you going to support them or throw them to the wolves? Yes, if they repeat the mistake and they repeat the mistake, then actually that demands action. But actually how you develop and how you nurture them and how you recognize the mistakes are part of anyone's developmental cycle is very important in developing you as a leader and communicating what sort of culture you have. And when you're given an unrealistic deadline, drastically insufficient resources, or yet another pointless or contradictory task to complete by a boss that some would say is hopelessly out of touch with reality, they're watching to see if you smile weakly and let the smelly stuff flow downstream, or you push back firmly and respectfully. They're watching you as the individual, watching you as leader, and they will follow your example. They're watching to see if they can trust you because deep down they want to achieve something that they're rather than just turning up and staying awake. As demonstrated in the last 12 months, where the pyramid of trust has been inverted for the industry. Before, you could only work from home if you really earned it. And even then in the office with the echoes of, are you really working? Are we really getting productivity? The industry has shown that it can be trusted. The employees within it have shown that they can be trusted. In fact, over-productivity and concern has led to fatigue and mental health care because overwhelmingly, people want to do the right thing. They just don't want to turn up and go to work and stay awake. They want to strive for a goal that's worth achieving, that becomes complete with a challenge that calls for their best efforts, and it is you as the leader that can take out their best efforts. Give them the tools to develop. They want a leader, if they try their best and they still fail, then they have their back behind them. And then they will sit with them, they'll identify training, and they will make sure that they're on the road to giving their A game next time. They want a leader of courage to lead them, and they want a leader that will serve them. Therefore, leadership to me is fundamental to what we are trying to achieve. You can codify it, you can have regulation, you can have purpose, you can have culture, you can have all the hats and all the pegs, and you can have them all aligned. But unless you have leadership and you invest in leadership, then they are meaningless because they are all integrated parts of the same jigsaw. It's almost like I see conduct, culture, and purpose like legs, 3 legs on a table. And the top of that table is leadership. And if you take one of those legs away, the table will rock. But without the top, you have nothing. Leadership is paramount to what we're trying to achieve. And I've captured all of this. There's a bit of self-promotion here in 3 books over the last 3 years. One on the role of the COO. The second coming out next week on the role of the Chief Control Officer, both of them pretty narrow reading audiences. And the one in the middle that means most to me is about my experiences in Bosnia, Donkey Melon Bully Beef. All 3 of them funded by the COO community. all three of them, are written by my understanding and musings and interactions with this community that returns me to the premise and the statement that overwhelmingly the CRO community is populated by a very decent group of individuals committed to doing the right thing, bright, intellectual, empathetic. Give them the platform to do their job, and then they will play their part more appropriately in the business and within the industry of taking us to that nirvana, that state of repaired reputation for the industry. And finally, my few words must go to my team that have brought you all together today. I'm just like the voice box. Gwen and the two Charlottes and Sophie and Tim and Holly and Patrick and Tim, thank you very much for your time. Thank you much for your efforts. Thank you for your fortitude. Thank you for the fluctuating changes over the last 12 months, how you've kept at it. Thank you for the highs and the lows, and thank you for bringing together the community for the next 3 days. I'd like to thank you all for attending. I hope you found this little muse of some interest. I think the time now is to open the curtains and let the show begin. Thank you all. Bye-bye.